This message has no affiliation with the Department of War. All right, Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to the Martin Memo. We're coming to you at the start of 2026, where the dust has finally settled on one of the most chaotic chapters in American history. And just when you thought that we were done with the joy and the word salads, she's back. As promised, I read Kamala Harris's memoir, 107 Days. And I know, I probably need a lobotomy after it. But now, the left-leaning media, this is being treated like the second coming of the Federalist Papers. But for those of us living in reality, it is a 320-page exercise in blame-shifting, grievance venting, and absolute delusion. She calls it 107 days because that's the time she had to save democracy after Joe Biden finally took the hint and stepped aside. But as we're going to discuss today, those 107 days weren't a sprint. They were a slow-motion train wreck. We've got snapshots of the pages, we've got the internal quotes, and we've got the perspective of the pundits, even the ones on her side who are starting now to turn. If you want to know why the Harris-Walz ticket didn't just lose but imploded, you don't need a political science degree. You just need to read between the lines of this book. Grab your coffee. This is the Martin Memo. The Martin Memo. Let's start with the big one, the elephant in the room, or rather the lame duck in the room. Throughout the campaign, Kamala Harris told us she and Joe Biden were joined at the hip. She looked us in the eye and said he was stronger than ever, running circles around his staff, and the most capable leader she had ever seen before. Fast forward to September 2025, and the story changes. In 107 days, Harris describes the decision for Biden to run for re-election in the first place as, and I'm quoting her here, recklessness. She writes that the stakes were simply too high for the choice to be left to an individual's ego or ambition. Now wait a minute. Hypocrisy alert. If it was recklessness for an 81-year-old man who can barely navigate a stage to run for the most powerful office on earth, why did she spend 3.5 years telling us that he was fine? She wasn't just a witness to the recklessness. She was the chief enabler. Her and Joe Biden, for that matter. She describes a phone call on July 21st in 2024 where she's at home, she's doing a jigsaw puzzle, of course, and Joe calls. He's out. But here's the juicy bit. She admits she was angry and disappointed with him after the June debate. Not because he was failing the country, but because he didn't realize how badly he'd done. She writes about the denial in the West Wing. But it gets even prettier, folks. She actually complains in the book that in Biden's 11-minute withdrawal speech from the Oval Office, he didn't mention her until the 9-minute mark. She was counting down the minutes. You know, she wasn't feeling bad for him or any of that. There wasn't sympathy. She was counting down the minutes until her name got mentioned. This tells you everything that you need to know about the chaos in this administration. While the world was on fire, while the border was wide open, the VP and the president were locked in a zero-sum game of who was shining and who was dimmed. Her husband, Doug Emhoff, is quoted in the book venting to Harris saying, "They hide you away for 4 years, give you impossible jobs, and now they ask if we're loyal?" Kamala says Biden was taking on water for his policy decisions. No, Kamala, the boat was sinking because you and Joe were both fighting for the only life jacket. Now let's look at the mechanical failure of the campaign. I want to draw your attention to page 29. This is a bombshell for anyone who cares about how our government actually functions. Harris writes, "I'd become concerned that the data was being filtered to manage Joe's mood and lift his spirits. I need straight talk. We have many pollsters. Are they all in agreement on what's being presented at these meetings?" Let that sink in for a second. The Vice President of the United States is admitting that the internal polling, the data used to make decisions for 330 million Americans, was being sanitized, because the president's staff was afraid he'd get grumpy. They were afraid that he wouldn't be able to sleep that night. Maybe he needed a little binky or a bib. This is not government. It is a daycare center with nuclear codes. She talks about her team, Kirsten Allen, Brian Fallon, and Josh Hu, for having to elbow their way into the campaign structure. To me, that sounds like a bar brawl for control. She had to bring in her own pollsters, David Binder, because she didn't trust the filtered nonsense being fed to Joe. This screams chaos. If the data was sugar-coated, why didn't she call it out in 2021? Or why not 2022? She only calls it out now because she needs a scapegoat for her embarrassing billion-dollar electoral college fail. Now, she wanted straight talk from her pollsters, but when she got in front of a microphone, all we got was the significance of the passage of time. She complains about filtered data, but her whole candidacy was a filtered vibe. All joy, no substance, and 100% artificial. Now let's pivot to the real Kamala, the one she tried to hide behind the moderate, tough-on-crime prosecutor mask that she wore on the trail. As we turn to page 46 and 47, here she leans into her progressive roots. She writes extensively about her time as California's Attorney General and her support for taxpayer-funded, gender-affirming care for inmates. She frames it as a medically necessary fight against Republican cruelty. Now let's think about the hypocrisy here. During those 107 days, her campaign spent millions on ads trying to convince voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan that she was a moderate who wouldn't ban fracking and loved the police. But in her own book, she's bragging about radical social engineering in the prison system. This is what we call peak liberalism. While working-class families were wondering how to pay for their kids' braces, Kamala was focused on hormone treatment for prisoners. It is a total disconnect from the priorities of the American people. And if you look at page 94 and 95, she takes a blowtorch to you and me. She claims that law and order is just a code for targeting minorities. She says states' rights is just a synonym for discrimination. She essentially smears anyone who believes in the Constitution as a closeted bigot. Kamala says she was smart on crime, but spending taxpayer dollars on surgeries for convicts while the murder rate in major cities was spiking? That's not smart. That's just another example of her priorities being as mixed up as her debate answers. All right, let's talk about the bread and butter issues. On page 213, Harris reflects on the economy. She touts Bidenomics, claiming they created manufacturing jobs and saved the Rust Belt. But then she admits with a straight face that they didn't get credit because the narrative was defined by the porous border. Wait a minute. Defined by the border? Kamala, you were the border czar. You were for the entire administration. On page 51, she admits the administration's achievements were invisible to voters, drowned out by failures. But then she has the nerve to blame Republicans for taking the cruelty of the border crosses. Conservatives have been screaming about the 5 million plus illegal crossings for years. We saw the fentanyl. We all saw the human trafficking that is still ongoing. And here she is in 2025 acting like the border was just some irregular migration project that just had a bad PR rap. Give me a break. And then there was a View moment. We all remember it. It was the hand grenade, as she calls it, on page 48. When asked what she would have done differently from Joe Biden, she said, "There's not a thing that comes to mind." There's not a thing that comes to mind as the border is out of control, as inflation is the highest it's ever been. Nothing comes to mind. In the book, she admits she blanked. She says she had no idea. She just pulled the pin on a grenade. That wasn't a mistake, folks. That was a moment of honesty. She couldn't think of anything because she was part of every single bad decision. Kamala says the headlines focused on the big stuff like the border. Yeah, that's because the border is the big stuff. You can't ignore a flood in your basement just because you repainted the guest room. We have to talk about how she managed her own party. It was a disaster. She writes about the war in Gaza, saying, "It's not a binary issue." She wanted nuance and complexity. But the voters in Michigan, they didn't want a lecture on history. They wanted a leader. She admits that Biden's loyalty to Israel was a problem for her campaign. She writes that Prime Minister Netanyahu was running out the clock to get Trump back in office. Maybe because he wants strong leadership in the United States, someone who will actually back Israel. This is pure blame shifting. She couldn't hold her own base together, so she blames the Israelis and she blames the unrealistic expectations of the voters. And then there's the VP pick. The book reveals the final reason she didn't pick Josh Shapiro or Pete Buttigieg. She writes that choosing a black woman married to a Jewish man was already asking a lot of America, and added Pete, a gay man, was too big of a risk. Thinking about that, the party of inclusion was playing identity politics on a napkin. She nixed the most popular governor in the country, Josh Shapiro, from Pennsylvania, because of internal fears about her own base's anti-Semitism. So then she ended up with Tim Walz, her emotional support pet, as one critic called him. She wanted to turn the page on Trump, but her book shows she was too busy checking the page for who was too risky to be seen with her. All right, folks, we're coming into the home stretch here, but I have to share this last page with you, page 230. At that point, I was deeply disappointed and realized my expectations had been quite unrealistic. There had been no small talk when I arrived for that interview, and there was none when I left. I took off my mic, said thank you to his crew, and walked away. No small talk. She just bailed. This is the quintessential Kamala Harris. When she isn't being served a softball by The View or Oprah, she shuts down. She's a diva on the political stage. She criticizes Trump for being combative with the press, but at least he stays in the room. She just takes out the mic and storms out because she's disappointed. And the voters saw that. They took note of it. They saw the evasion, the early exits, and the refusal to answer tough questions on the trail. No wonder they tuned out her campaign faster than a bad Netflix show. Folks, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the filtered polls, the taxpayer-funded prison surgeries, the recklessness of the Biden administration, and the disappointed media exits. So what are the takeaways of 107 days? It's not a comeback story. It is a victim card. Even the liberals are done. David Axelrod says the book is full of finger-pointing. Bill Maher says 107 days was too much time because the more people saw her, the less they liked her. Michael Smirkanish says she could have had 700 days and still lost. The book confirms what we knew all along. The Harris campaign was a chaotic, hypocritical, radical experiment that failed because it had no soul. It had joy as a slogan, but bitterness as its foundation. Kamala Harris says in the final pages that she cannot fail these people, the voters, but she did. She failed because she prioritized her ego over the economy, her nuance over the border, and her excuses over the truth. America chose strength. America chose results. And after reading this book, it's clear we dodged a 107-day bullet. All right, now it's time for my favorite part of the show, and that is the cold monologue. For those of you who do not know what the cold monologue is, you ask us questions throughout the week. My editor-in-chief writes them down. She puts them in this hat, and then I answer it. You have my pure, authentic reaction. So let's get into it. What are your thoughts on the whole scandal happening within Minnesota? Well, I assume you mean the Somali one, and that's just unreal. First of all, Minnesota, you got exactly what you paid for. You keep electing Democrat dunderheads in office, and these are the results that you are getting. So I don't have any sympathy for you. That being said, they are estimating now over $2 billion of fraud from Minnesota, from the Somali community, is occurring. Tim Walz said it's racist to bring that up, and it's the product of a white man. Well, he's not wrong. It's the product of himself. He allowed this to happen. He knew exactly what was happening. And the sad part is, too, the legacy media wasn't even reporting on this. It took a local podcaster to go around to the daycare centers to find out that there were no kids in attendance, that they kept stealing millions and millions of dollars, and it was going nowhere. That is just beyond sad. And now they're discovering it in Maine and Washington as well. These daycare centers, these scams that these Somalians keep on doing. It is very sad to see that that is occurring. Minnesota, I really don't have any sympathy for you. I wish I did, but you did this to yourselves. Hopefully it gets better. I do hope that you guys elect and get some common sense after this. I hope Mike Lindell gets into the governorship and destroys everything and builds it back better. But unfortunately, you're going to reelect Tim Walz. There's not a doubt in my mind, unfortunately. I do have some statistics on this whole Somali thing. There is a $250 million federal fraud case involving the theft of COVID-19 relief funds intended to feed hungry children. They took over $250 million that was supposed to help these hungry kids, and they just used it to enrich themselves. They put it in their back pockets. They went and put it back into their homeland of Somalia. This is absolutely egregious. This is fraud, and I hope that some justice does come out of it. It's very sad that this is occurring. It really is. I don't have any sympathy for you, Minnesota, but it is sad that it is occurring. So my whole stance on it, it's a shame, and I hope the right people are held accountable, and I hope they find more of this fraud and abuse all over and gut it. One of the things that I have said, and this isn't politically correct apparently, but people coming into America should be able to assimilate properly to our values. It is not racist to say that Islamic regimes and Islamic countries should not really be able to come into the U.S. Why? Because they do not assimilate to our values. They don't believe in Western civilization. That is the problem. That is why it's not racist to say people from Europe or people from Canada would assimilate better to the United States because they share our similar values. They can assimilate to us. We have roughly the same sort of ideology. So it is not racist to say that these other countries should not be allowed to necessarily join the U.S., or there should be a more strict screening process. That is not racist to say that in the least. With that all being said, well, folks, that's all we have in store for today. Be sure to join us on Monday as we have another live stream at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube Live. It has been great. We have so many people attending. Please bring all the questions, and I will make sure to answer them on live. Share your thoughts on X. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Martin Memo. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. Now, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. This is The Martin Memo. The Martin Memo.